When the dates showed October 30th, 1918, the First World War was over for the Ottoman Empire, and the Armistice Agreement was signed. The Ottoman state, which was defeated in the First World War, signed the Mondros Armistice Agreement on October 30th, 1918, and the Ottoman administration was trying not to attract the reaction of any Allied states by complying with this agreement, but the Turkish army was aware of everything. They had read the secret maps revealed by the Russians during the revolution, and they knew the grim end prepared for the Turks. Knowing this, the Turkish army was secretly organized and looking for a way of salvation. No matter how much attention the palace administration paid to the Mondros Agreement, the Allied states continued to invade the Ottoman Empire under the pretext of all kinds of events. Although the goal of these invasions was more or less clear, the Allied states were greedy and wanted to exploit more land. That is why they could not agree with each other, and while this disagreement was going on, the British came up with a very, very clever idea. The British said, "Let's occupy the lands belonging to the Ottoman Empire. Then let's tell our allies that there are our soldiers here, this is ours, and then let's collapse on that land." This was the great plan of the British at the end of the First World War. That is why the British were going to take Greece to the Turkish homeland in the future. The Allied powers, who were looking for an excuse in the Mondros Treaty, told the Ottoman administration that the Greeks were massacring the Turks in the Turkish homeland, and by distorting the events, the Turks were massacring the Greeks. Intervene, or we would. The Ottoman administration also wanted to send a soldier who was not an jihadist to suppress this incident. The Turkish army took this as an opportunity and sent Mustafa Kemal to Samsun with a high position. I would also like to open a parenthesis here. Mustafa Kemal's departure was also in favor of the people in Istanbul who were looking for a position because Mustafa Kemal was a very successful and appreciated person. That is why the palace sycophants wanted Mustafa Kemal to go. The plan for the army cadre was now more or less clear. In order to come to an agreement with these Allied states, who wanted to destroy everything by sucking the blood of the Turkish nation, there was no other choice but to fight for the independence of the Turkish nation, and the Turkish army was now prepared to hold the pen with bloody hands. Here, I should point out that the greed and barbarism of the Allied states pushed the Turkish army on this path. No matter how much the Turkish nation complied with the agreements, the Allied powers brought the Greeks to Izmir on May 15, 1919, to invade the Turkish homeland, although there was no tangible reason. The looting and barbarities committed by the Greeks in the Turkish homeland were so extreme that the Turkish nation was horrified to see what the Greeks, whom they had considered a friendly nation for years, and the Greek minorities living in the Turkish homeland did when the Greek army came, and they took their weapons and went to the mountains. The Turkish lions who fought to protect the honor of the homeland in these mountains are called İfe. Since these lions fought for the homeland against the enemy with guerrilla warfare style, it is impossible to talk about a complete victory, even though they won regional victories against the regular army against them. İfe is a Turkish name and means free fighter. The reason we mention this is because some human-like animals who lack honor and dignity among us say, İfe is a Greek name. Whatever we have about Turkishness is Greek. While the İfes started to fight against the Greeks on May 19, 1919, Mustafa Kemal set foot in Samsun and went directly to the basin from Samsun and issued a circular. In the circular, he made his side clear by saying that the people should show their reaction to the occupation. Whereupon, with the pressure of the Allied states, the Ottoman administrative staff, that is, the palace, recalled Mustafa Kemal. While Mustafa Kemal was distracting the palace, he was also gathering the army and organizing the people. After the basin, he went to Amasya. Here he issued a circular. In the circular, he summarized, "The nation's independence will be saved by the nation's determination and decision." He said. Mustafa Kemal was implementing the plan he had in mind without taking a break. From Amasya, he went to Erzurum, and in Erzurum, he did not recognize the palace administration and organized a Turkish Congress. A representation committee was established at this Congress, and a Congress was decided in Sivas. Although the palace administration tried very hard to prevent this Congress, it was not successful. At the Sivas Congress, the national borders were accepted and the target was set. Mandate and patronage were completely rejected. Either independence or death was sung from all mouths. Ideas became united, and it became a shame for the Turkish nation to live without independence. After years, the Turkish nation came together again behind a Turkish commander, and they were challenging the world. They placed the last bullet they had in their guns with the cries of either independence or death, and waited for the order of their commander. The Turkish nation was fulfilling heroic deeds that had never been seen in any other nation in history, as if it were an ordinary situation, and would once again write its name in golden letters in world history. Although the Congress convened in Sivas did not publicly recognize the palace administration, the two sides did not start radical statements against each other. After the Sivas Congress, the palace administration wanted to change the government and arrange a meeting with Mustafa Kemal, who carried the executive committee of the plan to Ankara, and they succeeded. Mustafa Kemal and his friends, who held a meeting with the palace administration in Amasya, ensured that the parliament was reopened in Istanbul at the end of this meeting. Mustafa Kemal knew that this was a trap and that the parliament could not take independent decisions in Istanbul under partial occupation, so he prepared a plan in his own mind. According to this plan, although he had not been to Istanbul, he would be elected as the president of the parliament, and it would be easy to reconvene if the parliament in Istanbul dispersed. But he could not be elected president of the parliament, and it was as he thought. The British disbanded the parliament when they realized that the parliament in Istanbul made decisions on behalf of the Turkish nation. Mustafa Kemal reconvened the parliament with difficulty. The palace administration was no longer Mustafa Kemal's only concern. All over the country, the enemy was attacking the homeland brutally. Armenians in the east, minority Greeks supported by the Greeks in the north, the French in the southeast, the Greeks in the west, and the British were supporting rebel troops in the Turkish homeland and preventing a full Turkish army from establishing dominance in the regions. The British supported these rebel groups through the palace administration and directed the rebels in this way, but there were also groups that they directly supported in some places. Mustafa Kemal was planning to solve the events in the east first and then respond to the Greek army after establishing a more regular army. For this, the Greeks would be prevented from advancing with the Ephes, and after the events and rebellions in the east were reduced and partially ended, it was necessary to wage a total war against the Greeks. For this, they first solved the problem in the east with Kazım Kara Bekir Pasha. The issue you should not confuse here is the Armenian genocide lie. Those who say this lie, they do not say it for this time. The Armenian media say that it happened during World War I. We will explain how this false event is a lie in another video, so subscribe and stay tuned. After the events in the east were partially resolved, action could be taken against Greece's regular and uncombatant army. The problem in the east was solved, and the French problem in the southeast was solved when the Ephes and local heroes, who were not a regular military unit, defeated the French army. But an agreement with France could not be signed here because the French were delaying this agreement, because if the Turkish army lost to Greece, we would invade back. We would like to commemorate one of our important heroes who fought against the French here, Ridvan Hoxha, the Imam of the Ulu Mosque. The calendar leaves show 1919. Kahramanmaraş is occupied by the enemy. The people are miserable. The French general organizes a ball in Kahramanmaraş one night to celebrate the occupation. He invites Armenians to the ball, and a very beautiful Armenian girl comes to the ball. The French general takes a liking to the Armenian girl and invites her to dance. But the Armenian girl said, "I cannot dance with you unless the Turkish flag in the castle comes down," and refuses the general's offer. Take down that piece of cloth in the castle. The next day, Friday, the people of Maraş saw that the Turkish flag in the castle had been taken down and replaced by the French flag. The people of Maraş are sad and desperate. Then the Friday prayer is called, and the people gather at the Grand Mosque. Nerves are tense, and everyone is very demoralized. Ridvan Hoxha, the Imam of the mosque, steps up to the pulpit for the Friday sermon and, amid the astonished looks of the congregation, takes the Turkish flag in his hand and says, "O congregation, I did not ascend the pulpit for the Friday sermon. Friday prayer is obligatory for free people. Friday prayer cannot be performed in a country whose fortress does not fly its flag. Let us first raise our flag again, and then perform our prayers. Suddenly, the voices of takbir rose in the mosque. The people attacked the castle with this feeling and courage. The French soldiers were scared, and our flag was raised to the skies again with the sounds of takbir. That day, the people prayed the Friday prayer on the bastion of the castle. Thanks to this completely real and unprecedented event in our history, the national consciousness of the people was awakened, and our flag, which was lowered by the power of arms, was raised again by the power of faith. The words of Ridvan Haja, the Imam of the Grand Mosque: Maras cannot be a rose for the enemy before it becomes a grave for us. Friday prayers cannot be performed in a country where the Turkish flag does not fly from its castle, has been engraved in golden letters in history. May Allah be pleased with them. May their places be in heaven. Let's leave our liberation heroes for another video, because it would take hours to prepare a video just to summarize the heroism of our nation. After the French were defeated by the local people and the Ifes in the southeast, the Turkish army faced two major problems: the barbaric Greek attacks and the palace administration's support for rebellions against the Turkish army. In order to win a decisive victory against the Greeks, the Turkish army wanted to switch to a regular army and formed a regular army from the EFEs. Of course, this was not so easy. It was necessary to give order and training to the Ifes, who did not know how to fight in an orderly manner. In addition, people of that period called every irregular military unit that fought against the Greeks an Ife, even though he was not among the real Ifes and thought of his own personal interests, such as Sirkez Etam, and this man is also considered one of the Ifes. This man realized that he could not earn much income in the regular army because he thought of his own personal interests and betrayed the Turkish nation. He joined the Greek side and fought with the Greeks against his old friends and the Turkish nation. After a difficult transition to the regular army, İsmet Pasha won the first battle of İnönü in January 1921 and the second battle of İnönü in March 1921 against the Greeks. But since the Greek army was more experienced in numbers, equipment, and regular warfare, İsmet Pasha lost the Eskişehir Kütahya battle in July 1921. As a result of this, they wanted Mustafa Kemal to be the head of the army in the parliament, and Mustafa Kemal said to the parliament that if you give me all the authority, I will be the head of the army. The parliament gave the authorization. Kemal Pasha took over the army as the commander-in-chief and pulled the army to the east of the Sakarya River. It was here that Mustafa Kemal first realized the war strategy, which was unprecedented in the history of war. This strategy is that if one of the troops retreats, the other troops should not retreat, and the retreating troops should take a position in the first place, they can take a position. This strategy is briefly, there is no line of defense, there is a line of defense. That line is the whole homeland. Since this strategy had not been applied in any war until then, the Greek commander was surprised and shifted his troops to withdraw after fighting for 22 days. Mustafa Kemal, who received the news of this, attacked Greece with the exhausted army and won the Battle of Sakarya. After the Battle of Sakarya, Mustafa Kemal tried to make the army equal to the Greek army with the orders of the nationalization orders and the weapons coming from Russia after the agreement, and this took 1 year. After the Battle of Sakarya, the Greek army tried to protect the lands it had taken rather than attacking. 1 year was very difficult for the Turkish army and Mustafa Kemal because the parliament was telling Mustafa Kemal to attack early, and they were saying that Mustafa Kemal would not attack anymore. This suited Mustafa Kemal to some extent because the discourse in the parliament gave the enemy a sense of comfort. Within this 1 year, the Turkish army secured the Russian border with the Kars Treaty, the southeastern border with the Ankara Treaty, and won political victories by signing a prisoner exchange agreement with Britain. The reason for the Ankara agreement with the French was that the French had lost hope for the Turkish homeland after the Battle of Sakarya. Hatay was left as a question mark for both sides in this agreement. At the end of a year, the Turkish army, which reached the same power as the enemy, began to look for time to attack. Mustafa Kemal knew that politics entered the Greek army, so he was adjusting his attack plan accordingly. If you are wondering how politics entered the Greek army, subscribe if you are wondering how politics entered the Greek army, We will explain the situation in the most detailed way in the future. Mustafa Kemal, who was aware of these situations, planned to break the front line of the Greeks with a strong attack and quickly expel the Greeks from the Turkish homeland. While these plans were being discussed, Yakup Sevki Pasha found this plan very risky and said that they would hang us if we failed while the plan was being decided. Mustafa Kemal Pasha said, "Don't worry, Pasha, don't worry. If we lose, you will hang me." The time for laying maps on a table and making plans with pencils was over. Now it was time for swords to speak, not pencils. Secretly, 2 armies were shifted south of Afyon from the 2nd Army to the 1st Army. Mustafa Kemal set off from Ankara to Afyon at the head of the army. Since he had to do this secretly, he organized a football tournament in Aksahir and left Ankara as if he was going to watch football, not to the front. While Mustafa Kemal was at the head of his armies, the Greek commander was having fun in Izmir. And finally, on the night of the Great Offensive on August 26, 1922, the fog on the big hill signaled that it was time for the wolves to descend into the valley. A Turkish cavalry unit infiltrated behind the enemy. This unit would cut off the supply route of the Greek soldiers. The 2 armies attacked the 2nd Greek Corps to prevent the main army from shifting troops to the 1st Greek Corps on the strongest Greek front. Later in the war, the Turkish army, attacking from the area where the Greeks were strongest on the front formed by the Greeks, had the Greek army in a wolf trap, and there was only one area left for the Greek army to escape, and there the Turkish mounted troops were destroying the supply routes to prevent the Greek troops from reorganizing and forming a new front. The Greek army was dying in this wolf trap, and eventually they could not stand it and fled. Even as the Greek army was retreating from the Turkish homeland, they were committing treachery and dishonor. In the villages, they stuffed Turkish people into mosques, burned the mosques, and burned people alive inside the mosques. The Turkish army, aware of this dishonor, was advancing at a speed that could not be seen in any other army other than the Turkish army in history, and was chasing the Greek army from the Turkish homeland towards the sea in front of their bayonets. In the city of Izmir, where the Greeks first set their feet in the Turkish homeland, hours or even minutes were left before they were thrown into the sea from the city where they entered the Turkish homeland with Turkish bayonets again after years. Hours before the Turkish cavalry unit entered Izmir, the Greeks were crushing each other to escape from Izmir, and there was a stampede in Izmir harbor. The Greeks were killing each other to escape. I don't think words will be enough to describe the cowardice of this Greek soldier. On September 9th, the Turkish army entered Izmir. While the war was going on in the city of Izmir, Mustafa Kemal entered Izmir and was with his army right behind the front line. It was unprecedented in history for a commander-in-chief to be so close to the battlefield. After these battles, the Turkish army and nation proved to the whole world once again what a noble nation they were. The events that happened in Izmir and the interesting events that happened to Mustafa Kemal in Izmir will be the subject of another video for now. We wish you peace for now. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel.